And we're about to jump into this conversation with Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. I'm so excited because I am like super intrigued and enamored with behavioral science.
You're not alone. It's one of those fields that nobody really knows what it means. And especially when I started studying it 15 years ago, they were just like, look at this poor scientist. But now it's everywhere. So times have changed. People are caring about human behavior.
Well, I mean,
yeah, she's gonna get me together. She's gonna get me together because I'm loose. It's about to happen. I can feel it.
I mean, considering the how technology has just evolved, right? Now we're all looking at human behavior in a different way. I remember a few years back, I was watching a TEDx about cyborg anthropology, which is this idea of tech being an extension of us. And so in the time that you started studying it now, what would you say are some key things that you've seen develop about behavior science?
What we're realizing is that there's a greater awareness that our risks and our perceptions around risk don't actually align to the reality of the risk that we're facing. So people overreact and care about things that are pretty minor, like whether or not the food you're feeding your family is organic. Moms freak out about that stuff, right? But it's actually a really minor risk compared to some of the things that we are facing as a collective society, like the temperatures increasing and the implications for how long our children can be outside on the playground. So we have to better calibrate. We have to align what we're actually scared of to the reality of what we should be scared of, stop overreacting and stop underreacting. So that's where this field really, that's what the field investigates, is trying to better align perceptions and reality. And what I'm seeing as a trend is people are becoming more aware of the reality of the risks that we're facing. So climate change is talked about a lot. COVID, of course, is front and center in news, and loneliness. Loneliness is something we have typically underreacted to for decades. It hasn't been talked about. It's one of those risks that we should be paying more attention to, but our brains, again, because we can't see loneliness, because it doesn't really seem like a risk that has an actual outcome, right? Like other risks, like hypertension or high cholesterol, we can see leads to cardiovascular disease. It's harder to make that connection to loneliness. But what I'm seeing is, thanks to behavioral science, we're connecting those dots better, and people are becoming better aligned to the reality of the risks that we face.
Oh my goodness. I think you just brought out a point that I don't know that I'd ever thought about. I never thought about loneliness as a risk. Now, and this is what's interesting about people starting businesses, because a lot of our listeners are business owners, women, and just general curious people. And, I think about it in a way of like, when we are pitching to investors and funders, being a solo founder is a risk. But I don't think I ever tied that to loneliness.
I would say that there's strength in numbers, right? We are creatures that haven't evolved that much since our ancestors were looking to survive, and there was survival in numbers. We needed that secondary person to be able to stay up at night while we were sleeping to make sure we didn't get eaten by like a tiger, right? So we are intrinsically wired to want to be part of a team or part of a group. So being by ourselves is not really natural. It's not aligned to our actual biological systems, which is why when we're by ourselves, we're not as productive in that sense. We're going to probably wake up more in the middle of the night, these micro awakenings that happen, because again, we have that innate wiring to make sure that we are safe at night. And even though we're safe now in modern society, we haven't really evolved past the reality of what our ancestors faced millennia ago. So it's really interesting to see how this now is playing out in modern society in terms of work, in terms of our health. We want to make sure that we are always surrounded by those that we say are close connections, so that we can build on those connections and feel safe and secure, so we can actually succeed in the workplace. So loneliness, I mean, it's multifaceted, and it rears its head across so many aspects of our lives, right? So absolutely, a solo entrepreneur, even though driven and motivated, would do better with those close connections around them.
Oh my goodness.
That just blew my mind. I don't know if anybody else just heard this and their whole mind just got blown. Omi, I don't know what just happened. Dr. Chakraborty just blew my mind. Okay, so I didn't have micro awakenings. I'm out here doing all kinds of things. But one of the things, like, especially as entrepreneurs that are out there, we normally start, and I always talk, we work in a silo. So we tend to work by ourselves, and not because we don't want other people around us. It's because it's hard to find that tribe of people, to that want to come along on this crazy journey,
Absolutely.
with us. So what kind of behaviors could we start implementing, right, to help us meet other crazy individuals like us? Because I'm going to be honest, this is a loose field. You know what I mean? We're out here wild.
Well, to really succeed, you want to make sure that those who are around you are ones that you trust. Trust is also really intrinsically wired in our being, in our success. We needed trust to be able to set up modern day civilization. That was a core principle of actually being able to do business and make sure that, okay, I'm going to do this for you and I'm going to get something in return. That reciprocity is something that we find true to be we find to be true universally, right? Regardless of where you're doing business, what country you're in, what demographic you are, we want to make sure that any interaction we have will be reciprocated. And for that to happen, there needs to be that basis of trust. So I'm kind of giving you the big picture context to why it's so important to find individuals that you have that trust with to be able to build out any sort of business venture that you are thinking through. Because we're not designed to be by ourselves. It's just not. It's not the nature's design for how we interact with society, how we develop our civilization, how we then create our business within that society and grow it and scale it and amplify it. All of that has to come back step by step by step to, do we have that reciprocity with that person that we are interacting with to take what we're trying to do to the next level? So you want to make sure that you have close people around that will reciprocate if there are promises being made or actions being done, and that is really entrenched in that trust. And if you have good connections like that across, maybe a handful of people to start, but a tribe, ultimately, you're really setting yourself up for success. These are kind of the building steps to making sure that your business flourishes. Create that trust, create that tribe.
So the interesting thing about it is, like, from a behavioral science standpoint, how does this play into like oppression in a way where like behaviors that have been like oppression has created this, I can't trust these people, those people, this thing. And then how do people work themselves out of that? Because what I'm hearing you say is actually you're supposed to start businesses or live life with and around, in and around other people. And that what comes with that, right, is some people you might distrust, but you can't then, or not can't, but it's not to your best and highest good for you to then say, well, I don't want to be around anyone because now I've gotten in situations where I can't trust. Because what I'm hearing you say is the kind of shift and kind of turnover in behavior is like, I'm not supposed to be by myself. Therefore, what comes with knowing that I'm going to have to run the reps, as I say, run the reps of who to trust is a part of that. But because I've been maybe hit with white supremacy in different ways or oppression, people might be able to think that way. Like what are some ways to navigate that? Or like, what are some things you maybe have seen in how that works, or how it's developing to our detriment in the society?
Yeah. So really good question. And I would say we have to remember loneliness is a risk factor for bad outcomes, right? Bad health outcomes, bad business outcomes. And those that have been historically disenfranchised, that have been left out of decision-making, that have been left out of societal development and growth, experience higher levels of loneliness, which leads to worse outcomes. So this is really systemic issue that runs deep, right? And now there's an increased awareness where we have to recognize, we have to call the problem what it has been, we have to course correct for it, we have to rectify it, and we have to bring those who have been historically disenfranchised into the opportunities that are available now, and correct for the loneliness component of there's so many things we could talk about regarding this, but since we're focusing on loneliness, yeah, if you've been disenfranchised, you are going to be experiencing loneliness. And we know there's a direct correlation between loneliness and worse outcomes, right? So let's just call it what it is. Let's make sure we establish that. And now that we've established that, how do we actually think about overcoming it individually as women of color, right? One thing is to make sure that we have representation, and we have representation on our boards. We make sure that those who invest in us look like us, and those that we then pay it forward to also look like us. So that's something that we can do as individual businesswomen. But it's even more than that. We need to improve our interactions with those that don't look like us, so we can build that trust and overcome that historical loneliness that is really systemic, that really runs deep. And the way to do that, and as hard as it might feel, it is possible to find some common ground. And I speak on this more across the political spectrum, like how do you get liberals to talk to conservatives? But it's the same concept that can be applied of how do you get like a white man to talk to a black woman? There is common ground. The one thing that we have in common, regardless of what we look like, is we are universally wired the same. If you cut us open, we look exactly the same. You cannot tell the difference, right? So we have to remember that and lead with that, especially if we want to build trust and if the indication is there that this is somebody that is worth building trust with. I'm not saying do this with everyone. Some people do not deserve your time, and that's probably a different show to get into recognizing like who to build relationships and who not to. But if it's worth your time to overcome loneliness by building that tribe and to include people that don't look like you as part of that tribe, the way to do it is to find the common ground. So we are human first. We all bleed red. We all want a better future for our children. We all care about the food we eat, the air we breathe. And I know these things sound really broad, but it is a starting point, our common humanity. And then depending on where you are in the US, we're American. We share that in common. We can start with that. Maybe we play soccer. Our kids all play soccer. So I love how I keep mentioning kids, by the way. I don't even have kids, but our kids play soccer. So we have that in common. We're all soccer moms or coaches. Maybe we like the same electric car because we're environmentally conscious. Find those threads of commonality and really build on that. And eventually you will be able to develop and build that trust out. And the differences will seem to be less and less and less.
You know, I got a question around loneliness. Is loneliness a feeling, or is it a concrete, in the concepts that you're talking through, is it a concrete thing or is it a feeling? Because then there's people who have people around them and still feel lonely. You know, are you seeing those have the same detrimental outcomes, or is it literally proximity to other human beings that can dictate or some of these outcomes?
I would say loneliness is a feeling and it's a risk factor for worser outcomes. So it's easy to kind of say loneliness is somebody's expression that if I wasn't here, nobody would care. If I ceased to exist, nobody would even notice. That's kind of commonly how we think about loneliness. But it is a feeling in the sense that let's say there was somebody who was super popular, a celebrity with a huge platform, that if they ceased to exist, people would definitely notice, right? But they could definitely still feel lonely. In fact, some of the top CEOs and celebrities have higher rates of expressing loneliness than the average population. But it's really commonplace to feel lonely. It's about 1 in 4 adults feel lonely. And that's pretty true for data we have across countries, right? So it's a really common feeling. And in addition to it being a feeling, it is also a risk factor. Loneliness is like stress. It increases your cortisol levels. It increases your micro awakenings throughout the night. And it results in a higher risk of adverse outcomes like heart attack and stroke. It is one of the many risk factors alongside blood pressure increase and high cholesterol increase that can actually result in worse patient outcomes. So for me, it's very important to make the distinction between feeling and risk factor, because it could be a feeling that somebody has that you wouldn't assume is lonely. And at the same time, you could see somebody who has 1 or 2 very close contacts, might be considered a recluse, doesn't feel lonely ever at all, right? So it's very much a feeling, but that feeling can propagate bad adverse outcomes. So it's also a risk factor.
So loneliness is a feeling and a fact. That's what you're saying. It's a feeling and it's a fact.
Absolutely.
And I love what you said about oppression, because I don't think business owners think about loneliness as it relates to oppression and their inability or their challenges in obtaining or growing or maintaining a business, right? We think about loneliness as something that we feel as individuals, but not as I'm lonely in my business because I've been historically oppressed. So there are some activities and opportunities that I haven't historically been able to go
Right.
after. So as we think about those types of things, in loneliness, how do we, especially now, because we're becoming more and more disconnected because we aren't seeing people physically. Like we're not, especially now everything's on, we're virtual. We're on. How do you connect even if I can only see you through the screen? Like I'm no longer in your presence.
Well, here we are connecting. I can feel your passion and your enthusiasm and all of it through the screen. So technology is dual use, right? The positives of it is it does allow for us to connect, and we should take full advantage of it. The technology has come a long way. I represent a company. It's a tech company, and it's a tool called We Don't Have Time. And this tool is free to use, and it connects people all around the world. It actually connects those who've been oppressed in one country to another to be able to share stories and experiences and come up with good ideas to help overcome some of the challenges that they're facing now, to see through some of the solutions to the impacts around climate change that they're facing, and to be able to amplify it across the world, right? Like, if we find a good solution from a vulnerable, because it's vulnerable groups that are suffering the most from the planet warming, wherever you are in America or anywhere in the world. So let's say these groups are able to use technology to come together and really share good ideas and scale some of these solutions. Here's an opportunity for technology to really play a role. So I encourage your audience to please download and check out the We Don't Have Time app. It's totally free to use. So that's one. But yeah, we have to recognize that historic oppression has led to modern day isolation. And then for those groups who are isolated as compared to other groups from opportunities, then in addition, something like COVID-19 adds that extra layer of challenge. And it's overcoming it takes, so many conversations to be had here. Overcoming it is a multifaceted approach that needs to be taken from individuals, that we've been discussing what individuals can do to build connection and build trust. But of course, it requires the private sector to recognize and include diversity at the highest levels, make sure that the shareholders, all the way to consumers, are truly diverse and truly represent overcoming this historical oppression. And then all the way to policymakers, from local to multilateral. This is a public, private, individual effort that is going to be required. And I know that's not satisfying because it's broad, and I'd love to get into the nitty-gritty of how to do that across the public sector, the public, and the private sector. But I think the biggest takeaway for your audience here is really to recognize, to call it what it is. We need to be able to talk about it. Nobody needs to be embarrassed or ashamed by the reality of what it is. We have to call the issues and challenges we're facing exactly what they are, so we can accurately overcome them and dedicate the time and the resources to overcoming them. But step one, as an individual, what can you do is connect. Download this tool, use technology right now, especially when it's still harder to meet people in real life, and take advantage. Take advantage of how far human ingenuity has come. And imagine how much further it's going to go when we bring in women and people of color into the actual solutions.
Yes.
Right? If we can harness some of that, let's harness some of that power that hasn't even been part of the solution yet. So we're just at the tip of the iceberg. So
that's going to be, listen, we have so many conversations, so much more conversation that we can have. But we are running out of time. So we'll definitely have to figure out how to get you back, because this has been truly, truly, truly amazing and informative. Dr. Sweta Chakraborty, thank you so much for joining us. She is an expert on climate change and also an amazing, amazing behavioral scientist. We have so many more things we could talk about. So we'll have to have you back soon. But thank you so much for joining the show today.
My pleasure. Loved it.